morning. I really admire all of you. For those of you who've been here since the beginning of South by Interactive, you guys are real survivors. I'm impressed. I unfortunately have to begin my talk with an apology, and for those of you who know me, you know what to expect, and that is that I have absolutely no PowerPoint slides to share with you today. So I know it'll be a huge disappointment, and if you want to leave, I totally understand, but I have no slides to share with you. I do have very detailed research reports that are behind all the comments that I'm going to make today, and I would certainly encourage you, if you're interested, to go out onto the web and search for patterns of disruption, Deloitte, Hegel, and that will turn up all the research reports. We've actually got one major research report and then 9 others that go into more detail around each of the patterns that we've been looking at. I have to say I had some ambivalence about choosing the topic today. Disruption, unfortunately, is one of the most overused and misused words in the business world today. Every entrepreneur that I know is leading a disruptive startup, and increasingly even many of the large established companies are claiming that they are pursuing disruptive strategies. And for the remainder, they are in what I would call disruption fatigue. They've heard so much about disruption, and it's been used so loosely and so often that they're just tired of it. They want to get away from it. So I think I have to start with, is there any value in pursuing this topic, given how much fatigue there is in it? And I do believe that there is some merit in the topic. There's something going on here. If you look at statistics, and many of you are familiar with them, but just to reiterate, the life expectancy of companies on the S&P 500 has basically gone down from, in 1937, the average life expectancy, if you made it onto the S&P 500, you were there for 75 years. You could just relax. And 1937 was the height of the Depression, one of the hardest periods in business history. If you look at the S&P 500 today, the average lifetime on the S&P 500 is about 15 years. Life expectancy has gone down by about 80% over that time period. At the same time that our human life expectancy is steadily increasing, our corporate life expectancy is diminishing at an accelerating rate. Another measure of topple rate is looking at companies that make it into the top quartile in terms of profitability and performance. Based on our analysis, since 1965, the topple rate of those in the top quartile has gone up by 40%. So companies are toppling out of those leadership positions at an accelerating rate. So what's going on here? You know, I think that one answer, and again, a bit of the kind of pushback around disruption is, well, come on, we've had disruption throughout history. What's new? What's different? For those of you who haven't read the book, I highly recommend it. There's a historian by the name of Carlota Perez who wrote a book called Technology Revolutions and Financial Capital. And she systematically looked at major technology disruptions throughout history, everything from the discovery of electricity to the automobile, all the major technologies that have disrupted business over the past several centuries. And what she found was a very common pattern to these technology disruptions. First, you had a burst of innovation and price performance around a specific technology as it came into the marketplace. But then that performance quickly leveled off and stabilized. And then you had a second level of disruption, which was people thinking about, well, how do we take this technology? What kind of infrastructure do we need in order to deliver this technology to the business world? And again, a burst of innovation around a different kind of infrastructure. In electricity, it was the decision to move power generation from distributed locations out to central power facilities. but then stabilization. And it allowed the rest of us in business to figure out what the hell to do with all this stuff, because it was now stabilizing. The interesting thing here with digital technology is it's not stabilizing. It's continuing to improve at exponential rates. The core technologies of computing, storage, bandwidth, continuing to accelerate in performance improvement. And those technologies are spilling out into other technologies like 3D printing, the automobile, robotics, where those are starting to go exponential in terms of price performance. So the disruption is cascading out in some very powerful and unforeseen ways. So I think it suggests that there is something different here. It's not just another technology disruption like electricity or the steam engine. It's a cascading set of disruptions that are persisting over an extended period of time. That creates a very challenging world, I think, for all of us, but also huge opportunity. Disruption, one of my key messages is disruption is an opportunity as well as a challenge. So it's useful to understand the nature of disruptions, both from the perspective of the incumbents who might want to stay around a little bit longer, and some of the new entrants who are looking to find ways to really make an impact in particular markets or industries. And even the attackers, those who succeed in disrupting the incumbents, find out that they're very quickly and unexpectedly being attacked themselves. So disruption is relevant, I think, to everybody. I think it's somewhat appropriate that my talk was scheduled for March 15th. Many of you may be familiar with the expression, beware of the Ides of March. It was a day on the Roman calendar that actually corresponded to March 15th. And it also marks the day in 44 BC when Julius Caesar was assassinated. Perhaps one of the most famous early political disruptions, where a global incumbent leader was definitely displaced as part of a transition from a republic to an empire. And perhaps it's not a coincidence either that today is primary day in the US, where we have the potential for some further disruptions in the political sphere. So what is the definition of disruption? I mean, again, part of my concern is it's used very loosely as anything new or innovative. I want to adhere to a definition that is pretty rigorous in terms of looking at the impact, at the outcome of disruption. And for me, disruption ultimately is measured by the displacement of leading incumbents. Does it actually displace those who are leaders today in a market or industry? And the method of disruption is through an approach that is very challenging and difficult for the incumbents to replicate. There's a reason why they don't quickly just respond and defend their position. It's very challenging to respond. And in particular, at least based on the work we've done, the biggest impediments or obstacles to response are either economic. On the one hand, it could be cannibalization, significant cannibalization of my existing revenue or profit streams. I have to walk away from a lot of the income that I'm currently generating in order to respond to this disruption. Or alternatively, it requires me to write off a significant portion of my assets that I've invested a lot of money to put into place. That's really hard to do. And then, so there's the economic challenges that are associated with these disruptive approaches. And the other challenge is more of a mindset challenge. The effective disruptions come in and challenge some of the most basic assumptions that we have about how business is done and how value gets created. And we can stay in denial for a long time, particularly if we were hugely successful around an alternative set of assumptions, and just resist the notion that there's a new set of assumptions that we need to adopt. So that, in our view, is why it's so difficult, why it's so challenging for a lot of incumbents to respond to the disruptions that are occurring. At its heart, disruption is about economics and mindset. And it's easy to get distracted by the technology. I cringe every time I hear about somebody talking about a disruptive technology. Technology by itself is not disruptive at all. It just sits there immobile. What makes it disruptive is the economics that are enabled by that technology, and understanding those economics and why they are disruptive is critical to carrying out a disruptive move. So just to complicate life even further, there's another set of distinctions to make around disruption, which is we've ended up identifying 3 levels of disruption that are playing out in our business landscape. I'd say that the vast bulk of the discussions around disruption are around what I would describe as one-off disruptions. Something comes into a particular market and challenges the leaders, displaces the leaders, and game over. But it's the only time it's going to happen. You know, the classic example of refrigeration that came in and disrupted the home ice delivery business. Powerful story, an entire industry left in shambles, but it was only going to happen once. On the other side, at the other extreme, our belief, based on the work that we've been doing, is that there are a set of disruptions that are pretty universal. They're going to hit all of us in one form or another over time, and our survival hinges on our ability to respond effectively to those disruptions. We wrote a book called The Power of Pull, which I highly recommend to you if you haven't read it. But in the book, we talked about the big shift, which is our research around the long-term trends that are reshaping the global business landscape. And we believe there's a very disruptive big shift that's going to challenge all the leading incumbents. And there are many ways of describing the nature of these universal disruptions. Just one of them, as an example, is the notion of moving from a world of push to a world of pull, hence the power of pull. The notion here is that the way large businesses were created over the past century, couple of centuries, was around push-based models. You basically developed a forecast and prediction of what demand was going to be, and then you pushed all the right people and resources into the right place at the right time to meet that demand. Very effective and efficient way of organizing resources and mobilizing them. The challenge in the big shift as we move into a more uncertain and volatile world is forecasts and predictions are more and more challenging. And in that kind of world, our belief is the most successful companies, the companies that will survive this disruption, are those that move to what we would describe as pull-based platforms, scalable pull-based platforms, where you can draw out people and resources when you need them and where you need them, rather than pushing them into the right place at the right time in advance. And when I talk about scalable platforms, I'm talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, increasingly millions of participants. So these are really big global platforms. Highly disruptive of the way traditional business has been done. And again, our belief is universal. Every company at some point is going to have to face up to how do we transition from a world of push to a world of pull, and it's not going to be easy. But there's a middle layer. So I've talked about one-off disruptions on the one side, one-time events, only time they're going to happen, and then universal disruptions on the other. About a year ago, we came up with the idea and said, you know, as we thought about disruption, there's a middle layer of disruptions, we called them patterns of disruption, that are likely to hit more than one market. So they're not going to be one-off disruptions. They will happen in multiple markets, but not all markets. They won't be universal. They'll be restricted to certain markets. So that's kind of interesting. What if we could describe those patterns of disruption, identify what those patterns might be, and more importantly, also be able to describe the characteristics of markets that would be vulnerable to a particular pattern of disruption? We thought that would be really interesting, that now you could help to really focus and say, given the market that I'm looking at, what are the 2 or 3 patterns that I might be most vulnerable to, and how could I respond effectively to those patterns? So that's a very different form of disruption. And we ended up identifying 9 patterns of disruption. We don't claim that they are definitive, that they're the only patterns of disruption. At least based on the work we've done, we found 9 that we're pretty comfortable meet that definition. And they're all about enhancing the customer ability to get far more value at far lower cost. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail because I don't have the time into all 9 patterns. I apologize, but again, the research is all available online, freely available. So if you're interested, you can go into a deeper dive, and there's an individual report around each pattern, so in addition to an overview report. But I'll quickly go through the 9 just by name and a brief example to give you a sense of what the ground we covered was. And we ended up dividing them into 2 broad categories, because 9's a lot to keep in mind. But we ended up seeing that across the 9, there were 2 categories that seemed to group into these 2 categories. The first one is a set of patterns that are about transforming the value-price equation. And in one case, one example of that is unbundling products and services. A classic example of that kind of pattern that's already playing out is in the newspaper industry, taking a bundle of content and a whole set of companies and new entrants coming in and slicing into that and just offering one piece of the bundle, providing the user, the reader, with just what they want, not the whole bundle, because they're not interested in the whole bundle. A second pattern in this category is shortening the value chain, dramatically removing significant layers in the value chain in a way that's disruptive to incumbents. Classic example here is the early days of the move from the analog camera business to digital cameras. For those of you who can remember that far back, once you took a picture, you actually had to remove the film, take it to some place to be developed, come back at some later point and pick up the finished photos. Huge expense and inconvenience for the user. Digital cameras removed that part of the value chain. You didn't have to do that anymore. Once you took the picture, you had the picture. Highly disruptive. Third pattern of disruption, aligning price with use. Moving from fixed upfront pricing models to models that are driven by usage-based pricing, or ideally even value or impact-based pricing. Customer only pays for the value and impact that they get from the product or service. And then finally, within that category of transforming the value-price equation, converging products, bringing products together in ways that are disruptive to established players. We're all familiar with the subsequent movement in cameras from digital cameras to the smartphone, where you no longer needed a specialized camera device or a flashlight or an alarm clock. It was all converged together into a single product, and you paid much less for that converged product than you ever would for the full array of products that you previously had to buy. So that's one category, transforming the value-price equation of patterns of disruption. 4 of the patterns fit into that category. The 5 other patterns fit into another category which have to do with harnessing network effects. And in that category, we had things like expanding marketplace reach as a pattern of disruption, a new way of helping to connect buyers and sellers in much more efficient ways so that they can do business much more effectively. Amazon would be a classic example of expanding marketplace reach. Probably the most covered pattern of disruption in terms of the stories that are being told is the notion of unlocking adjacent assets. Here, Airbnb and Uber are classic examples of taking assets that were previously not considered part of the market or industry and making them available and dramatically expanding the choice available to the users through those additional resources or assets. Yet another pattern, turning products into platforms. In this case, the notion of what Android's been doing in the smartphone business in terms of taking a device, a mobile device that was typically a very siloed device where you bought everything from a single vendor, device vendor, and now being able to expand it and having more and more choice both at the device level and at the application level because of a common operating system. Yet another pattern of disruption, connecting peers. Here the notion is moving from hub and spoke kinds of networks to much more peer-to-peer mesh networks. Classic example in this case is the early applications of blockchain technology to create peer-to-peer networks within financial services. And then finally, a final 9th pattern of disruption for us is the notion of distributing product development, mobilizing a larger and larger number of participants to come up with a single product. Classic example here is Wikipedia and what Wikipedia has done to the encyclopedia business by mobilizing a very large community of contributors. So, 9 patterns of disruption. They will play out in more than one market based on our research. Some of them already are playing out in more than one market, but not all markets. And for each of them, we've identified characteristics of the marketplace that would make them vulnerable to that particular pattern of disruption. Just to give you a couple, go into a little more detail on a couple of these examples. I mentioned the notion of aligning price with use, shifting from this fixed upfront pricing world to one that's more usage-based and performance-based pricing. I think this is a response to increasing customer power. We're all gaining more power as customers, and I think we're all questioning, why do we have to pay a large amount of money up front if we're not yet using the product and may only use it sporadically? Why should we have to pay for all this unutilized capacity? Why not just pay for what we use? A key enabler in this pattern of disruption is the Internet of Things technology. If I can't monitor the usage of the product, how it's being used and how often and in what ways, it's much harder for me to adopt usage-based pricing. It's challenging for incumbents because it does cannibalize significantly. If you're an incumbent that is used to getting a lot of money up front for a product, and now you have to give up that money up front and hope that you'll get some money along the way, that's a big cannibalization of your existing revenue stream and profit stream, and very difficult to embrace. And in the terms of the mindset, the assumptions we have about business, many of the businesses have come to the belief that customers want to own something. They want to have it all to themselves, versus the notion that no, actually, they just want access and usage when it's appropriate. That's a very different mindset And again, for many traditional companies, very difficult to get their minds around in terms of what customers really want. If you think about the market conditions that are required for this kind of pattern for vulnerability to this kind of pattern, obviously markets where there's a large fixed asset sale or significant fixed spend by customers up front, those markets are probably more vulnerable to these than those where it's not the case. It also helps that there's highly fluctuating and volatile usage rates. If my usage is pretty consistent and predictable, I'm maybe more willing to pay up front than if I really don't know how much I'm going to use this product or service. It also helps that there's a very fragmented customer base with low barriers to entry. Barriers to entry both by new companies that can offer these kinds of pricing models and barriers to entry in terms of drawing new customers in. In many of these cases, the disruption is creating entirely new markets of people who previously just couldn't afford that large upfront payment. But now, if I'm paying just on usage, hey, good. Obviously, one of the early examples of the application or the development of this pattern of disruption is in the IT industry with cloud computing, the movement to software as a service and the movement to infrastructure as a service, dramatically reducing the cost of participation in terms of getting access to some of the most sophisticated and incredible IT resources that were ever developed, but accessing it and being charged on it only on a usage basis. If you look at examples of other industries that we think have these characteristics that make them vulnerable to this particular pattern of disruption, I would include automobiles, insurance, and potentially, a little more speculative, but even high-end fashion as being markets that would be vulnerable to usage-based pricing. So that's just one example of a pattern of disruption. Another example I mentioned is unlocking adjacent assets. This one has the iconic examples of Uber and Airbnb, but it's providing effective access to significant stockpiles of underutilized assets that are outside of the existing market. That's a key requirement. They can't be just sitting within the market. They are outside the market. They were not considered part of the market in the past. And they offered customers a lot more choice, a lot more versatility, and responsiveness in terms of their needs. And again, a key enabler in this pattern is Internet of Things technology. The ability to monitor usage of these assets and how they're being used is a big deal. It's challenging to replicate. In this case, the challenge for incumbents to replicate the disruptive moves is that it requires a willingness to write down significantly massive asset investments that you've made in the past. You have to say those assets really aren't as valuable as I thought they were. And that's a big challenge. And then the notion of business assumptions, mindsets. I mean, I remember in the early days of the Airbnb industry, Airbnb business, when the hotel executives would look at me and say, "Are you crazy? Somebody would go into a stranger's house and I would open up my house to a stranger? That's completely absurd." So the mindset, the assumptions, were just fundamentally resistant to the notion that this was actually a disruptive move. So again, here now, what are the market characteristics that would make a market or industry vulnerable to this particular pattern of disruption? One of them is high volatility of demand. If demand is relatively stable and predictable, it's probably not going to be as vulnerable to this pattern as if you have highly volatile demand with big spikes and valleys. Second characteristic is where the traditional approach, the approach of the incumbents, requires significant capital investment. So if there's a lot of assets already in place by the incumbents. And then a third characteristic is that there have to be underutilized substitutable assets in adjacent markets. And they have to be adjacent, not part of the core market. I think one of the interesting confusions in this area, I know a lot of companies in the construction equipment industry are latching on to this notion of taking construction equipment that typically isn't highly utilized and making it available on a rental basis to those who want it while it's sitting idle at a construction site. That's not disruptive. The incumbents will be able to do that extremely well because they're already in those asset categories. It's got to be an asset that's outside the traditional market or industry that's now coming in and being made available to the customer. If you think about the early examples, again, the hospitality industry and urban transportation certainly are feeling the effects of this pattern of disruption. In terms of the future, markets or industries like short haul product shipment, vulnerable to this, and potentially even electric utilities as we move to more decentralized power sources that were not previously part of the grid, and where battery technology and microgrids are changing the economics of how that power might be shared among the participants. So those are just two examples to give you a little more flavor for what we mean by the patterns of disruption in terms of both why they're so disruptive and what kinds of characteristics of markets would make them vulnerable to this disruption. I'd say in general, again, just stepping back because it's easy to get lost in the details across all 9 patterns. Remember I mentioned the 2 categories, transforming the value-price equation and harnessing network effects. Our general belief is that while all these patterns are pretty powerful and can wreak havoc in a particular market or industry, the ones that ultimately have the potential to create the most value are going to be the ones that harness network effects. Once you achieve critical mass and the network effects are generated, it's very hard for somebody else to come in and unseat you. Versus, again, if it's just about transforming the value-price equation, remember my story about cameras. Digital cameras disrupted analog cameras, but very shortly after that got disrupted themselves by convergence of products, the smartphone. So yes, you get a one-time disruption, but better watch out because there are other disruptions that could quickly unseat you as well. So given all this, what do we do with all this? How do the incumbents respond? I think from our experience, first of all, there's a lot of relief when we share the perspective with executives because, again, they're kind of overwhelmed with this notion that disruption comes from anywhere, anytime, and there's no way to anticipate. This gives at least some focus as to where some of the greatest vulnerability might be in your market or industry, and that ability to anticipate can be very helpful, particularly if leaders it's been noted that the most effective leaders these days are those who have 2 characteristics. One is humility, and the other is optimism. If you're a leader who has humility and are willing to question the basic ways you're doing business today and realize there may be better ways on the horizon, and you have optimism that actually you can harness some of these capabilities and create value for your customers and yourself, it reduces the temptation to go into denial and to rationalize why the existing way is going to persist forever. So having that humility and optimism and being able to anticipate a particular pattern of disruption is good. There's secondly the notion of what I've called zooming out and zooming in. It's not just important to be able to anticipate the disruption. That's the zoom out, to be able to see how this disruption might play out. But then zoom in, and in a very short time horizon, say, what are the short-term initiatives that I could take that would accelerate my ability to respond effectively to this disruption? And it's the combination of the zoom out, zoom in that, from our experience, actually helps incumbents to respond. And then there's a third element for incumbents, which is something that we call scaling edges. But it's the notion that rather than trying to transform your entire business, focus on finding an edge to your existing business that you can scale in a way that will allow you to effectively respond to the disruption. It could be fine if you're early enough in anticipating the disruption. It could be an edge that will be the disruptor itself in your market or industry. And if you're too late, if the disruptors are already playing their games and they've achieved their critical mass or whatever, scaling edges can be a way of exiting your current business and finding a new business that will ultimately become your core if you scale it rapidly enough. And at the end of the day, I guess one of our key recommendations to executives in large incumbent businesses is the notion, resist the temptation to just respond narrowly to this one pattern of disruption. Because again, if you recall my earlier comments, our belief is that we're actually in a period of time where there are some universal disruptions. So our recommendation is use this pattern of disruption that's coming after you as a catalyst to transform your business around some of the more universal disruptions. So how can you use this as a way to shift from a push-based model to a pull-based model? How can you use this set of initiatives to move from a classic way of organizing business that we describe as scalable efficiency to a model that's much more organized around scalable learning? Because if you do that right, our belief is you will not only be effective in responding to that particular pattern of disruption, but you'll position yourself to be much more able to navigate through a continuing set of disruptions that will play out over time. So that's for the incumbents. I think from the viewpoint of entrepreneurs who are trying to harness the patterns of disruption, we believe it provides a framework that can help the entrepreneur to focus on the highest impact opportunities, both in terms of the how, the approach, and the where. Which markets are going to be most vulnerable to this approach? So if you're really picking a market to go after, with this approach, here are the 2 or 3 markets that would have the highest potential where you could really unseat the leaders and become a leader yourself. And one of the key notions in that context, and we've developed this as part of our research, is, as entrepreneurs know, timing is everything. I mean, if you're too early, good luck. If you're too late, too bad. In this context, what we've ended up looking at are what we would describe as catalysts, elements that you can look for. So we talked about the characteristics of a market that would make it vulnerable, but that doesn't particularly say when it's going to be vulnerable. It may be today, it may be a year from now, maybe 5 years from now. Looking at catalysts helps to understand the likely timing of the disruption. And if you're an entrepreneur, in some cases, you can actually mobilize the catalyst to help increase the timing of the disruption. Or if the catalysts are already in place, you know you can go in there and start to invest aggressively because the timing is right. So I guess if I step back from all of this, and it's been a pretty broad terrain that I've been sharing with you, I guess my broadest message is to resist the temptation to dismiss this topic of disruption. No matter how overused and how misused it is, there is something there. We are in an increasingly disruptive world. There's more and more evidence that says that disruption is playing out in a broader and broader set of arenas. And if we understand and anticipate the dynamics of these disruptions, we can actually turn threat into opportunity. An opportunity that's going to allow us to create far more value than we ever would have imagined possible in more traditional times. So it's a big, exciting thing to go after if we understand and anticipate the patterns that are playing out. And before we dismiss all this talk about disruption, we might want to just go back and remember Julius Caesar. Plutarch actually wrote at the time that a seer actually warned Julius Caesar that harm was going to come to him by the Ides of March. And Caesar dismissed the seer as a dreamer and actually laughed as he went to the forum where 60 people surrounded him and stabbed him to death. So be careful about dismissing the potential for disruption. Thank you very much.